Last year, the Institution of Civil Engineers officially endorsed the new engineering contract for all construction work in the UK and overseas. ICE decided to recommend the NEC3 suite of contracts in preference to its own long-established conditions of contract. Since the first edition was published in 1993, NEC has been used for many high-profile construction projects such as Crossrail and London 2012. In this programme, we're going to take a look at how the NEC3 engineering and construction contract, and in particular its programme, can help site teams achieve higher levels of success.
And here to help us do that is John Broom, Managing Consultant from Leading Edge Projects Consulting Limited. John is also Chair of the Association of Project Management's Contracts and Procurement Special Interest Group, and he also gained his original PhD through research into the new engineering contract. Thank you very much for joining us, John. Now, that was quite a significant development by the ICE Council. What were the reasons for recommending the adoption of the new engineering contract?
I think one of the reasons was just that the existing ICE conditions just weren't selling enough, and therefore there wasn't the market to bring out a subsequent edition. And related to that was that their popularity had been replaced by the new engineering contract, which really was achieving its objectives of clarity, greater clarity and simplicity compared with traditional contracts, greater flexibility, so range of applications, and greater stimulus to good project management, which delivers projects on time, cost and quality. And it's increasing use in different sectors and around the world.
So it's used on a widespread basis all over the world?
Yeah, absolutely, and increasingly so.
Okay, tell us how the new engineering contract has developed over the last 17 years, and you've brought a few examples in here to show us.
Yeah, well, it all started in 1993 when the first edition was of the what has now become the engineering construction contract was published. So this is the black book. It's the big beast of the family. It's for heavy engineering, so civil engineering, mechanical engineering, building work of medium to major complexity. Okay. That was followed by the purple book, or the engineering construction subcontract. So this is the back-to-back contract for use with that black book, where there's substantial subcontracting or substantial elements of subcontractor design. So on a building project, typically mechanical and electrical would be let through that. In 1995, I think it was, the professional services contract was published. So in a construction environment, that would be design, but it's for any professional services, need not be construction related. It's been used for lawyers, which, considering its requirements to program, communicate within set timescales, and written in plain English, they have trouble with. And also at the same time was the adjudicator's contract, which is a three-way contract. So it's when there is a dispute, which fortunately there are far less under the NEC, so the people having the dispute and the adjudicator who's been brought in to resolve it. 1998, they published the engineering construction short contract. So this is for low risk, low complexity work, not necessarily low value work. Right? So single or two trade, repetitive work, etc. What was happening was that contractors were saying, hang on, the purple book, the full back-to-back version, is a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut for simple subcontracts. So they started amending this to be a subcontract to that black book. So the panel don't like people amending their contracts because they all do it differently. So what they did was they published this short contract. So the main difference between that and the blue book, the straight short contract, is obviously the names of the characters change, so the employer becomes the contractor becomes a subcontractor, but also the timescales are compatible, so communication can come down the line and back up. 2005, they updated the whole family and became NEC3, and the new members of the family were the term services contract, which, like the professional services contract, can be used for any term services. So it can be used for hard term services like motorway maintenance, but also soft services like cleaning, reception services, and with a little bit of tweaking, IT and outsourcing as well. They also published the framework contract in 2005. And this is where the client has a requirement for projects of a certain sort for 4 or 5 years, but they can't actually define what those projects are in a succinct, definite enough way. So it defines the overarching relationship, then individual projects drop out and they're let under one of the other forms. 2008, the term service short contract was published, and this is really for simple term services, so simple maintenance. So if you're a housing association and you just want a window's got broken, call someone out to fix it. Yeah, nothing major. And it's got December 2009 on it, but it was February this year, 2010, and it's the supply contract and this is the short supply contract and the supply contract. The supply contract is used where there's an element of bespokeness about it. So whether it's the employer designing it or the supplier designing it, it's designed specifically for this project or works or whatever. Right? The supply short contract is more for commodities, so bought off the shelf items. And with that, the family is complete, or pretty much complete, and can pretty much be used for any works, goods or services, not just in construction, across the board.
Okay, so let's get the nomenclature right. It's not the new engineering contract anymore, it's NEC3.
Yep, NEC3. What happened was, like Labour, they discovered that you couldn't remain new, fresh and vibrant forever. So in the second edition, they started dropping the new engineering contract and just referring it to as the NEC family, but it was still new engineering contract. Third edition came out and they dropped it completely, and it's just NEC3. Okay. So yeah, the NEC3 engineering construction contract, NEC3 professional services contract, etc., and so on like that.
Okay, now today we're focusing on the programme, so let's take a look at what the contract says that the programme should show.
First of all, the programme should show information identified in clause 31.2, which is much more comprehensive than traditional contracts. In summary, clause 31.2 specifies important contract dates, such as completion dates, order and timing of the contractor's operations, and for each of these operations, a statement of how the contractor plans to do the work. Order and timing of the work of the employer and others as agreed. Provisions for float and time risk allowances. Other information stated in the works information. As well as showing this information, the programme should be practicable, realistic and comply with requirements. Lastly, the programme should be updated by the contractor on a regular basis, showing progress and/or delays, whoever they are caused by.
Now let me just pick up on that last point about updating the programme. If delays are attributable to the employer, what happens?
Under the NEC, you have compensation events, and compensation events are effectively employer-owned risks. So the majority of them are because the employer or his agents, the project manager and the supervisor, haven't done something or they've changed something. So there's no point in deleting them, lawyers, because they become breaches of contract. Right? There are 4 other ones which I call neutral, as in they're not in the direct control of either party. So things like weather, physical conditions, force majeure, employer's risk, which are sort of insurance types of events. So whether the contractor can mitigate the consequences, but he can't influence the weather. Physical conditions, the employer can do a better site investigation, yeah? But the physical conditions are what you find them to be.
And what about delays attributable to the contractor?
Well, the contractor has float in the programme, or it owns certain types of float in the programme. If those delays are attributable to the contractor, he needs to show them in his programme, as well as what he's going to do about them.
Now what you've done for us is identify 6 levels of use of the programme. Now these are intended to be taken in sequential order, so let's take a look at the first.
Use 1. Basic contractual compliance for the employer and others involved in the project.
So what does this mean in practice? Tell me who the others are for a start.
Well, the others have got a big O at the start, a capital initial, which means they're a contractually defined parties, and basically they're anybody who's not mentioned elsewhere in the contract. Essentially they are other organisations or individuals who the employer is responsible for managing, influencing and so on. So if they don't do something, then that is also a compensation event.
So how does the project manager fulfil his duties here?
Well, the project manager in this role is effectively the guy or girl who is project managing the contract on the employer's behalf. So what he is trying to do is make sure that his side of the contract, or bargain if you like, does everything they should do. So in that sense, what he wants is he wants a clear statement from the contractor of what do we need to do, the employer and others, me, the supervisor, by what time. And what I recommend, so that there isn't a compensation, what I recommend is that written in the works information, you say, can we have a schedule which is updated on a monthly basis or whenever the program is updated, saying, this is what I've got to supply by when.
And what do we mean by works information?
Works information, technically in the contract it says specifies and describes the work, so the end result, and states any constraints on how you get there. So can't exceed noise levels, got to follow British standards, etc., thing like that. In traditional speak, it's the specification and the drawings.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Let's take a look at the second level of use of the programme.
Use 2. Contractual compliance for the contractor.
So the project manager checks the programme to ensure that the contractor is compliant with his obligations. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Really, this is just a check to ensure that what the contractor has priced up for and programmed contains everything in the works information. Yeah. So the contractor wants to know if it doesn't early, because then he can tell his bosses, we've underpriced, and by the way, we need to plan in this, and the sooner you plan in something, the cheaper it is to actually correct it, do it, etc. Likewise, the project manager on behalf of the employer wants to know if everything's in there, because if it isn't in the original works information, then he wants to add it in, then the sooner he adds it in through a compensation event, the less the cost, because you can manage it. So really it's about identifying it early to minimise the effects on whoever it falls, those effects.
So it's in everyone's interests to ensure that it all goes smoothly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, are you able to give us an example to illustrate what we're talking about here?
Project manager looks at it and says, is it complete? Is there something missing from the programme which I thought was in the works information? Yeah. Is it practical in terms of does the sequence, either within an operational bar, the method statement if you like, contain everything and is logical, and equally do the bars in the programme fit together, and are they realistic? So in terms of timescales.
So this is a check that the contractor has a realistic, practicable and fully inclusive programme.
Absolutely.
How is it presented?
Well, contractually, however the contractor wants, because the contract doesn't actually say about how it's presented, it just says what has got to be shown. So unless the employer's written something else in the works information, the contractor's absolutely free to present it how he likes. However, what I recommend is that you sit down and you have a discussion up front and say, how can I present it as a contractor that you will understand it?
So informal communication underpins formal communications.
As a general rule, pretty much a rule rather than a guideline, for anything under the NEC, I always recommend discuss and agree informally before the formal communication comes through to be rubber stamped for acceptance.
Okay, let's move on to the third use of the programme, and it's a big one.
Use 3. Efficient and rapid assessment of compensation events.
Okay, first of all, define for us what a compensation event actually is.
Well, as I said, a compensation event is an employer's risk effectively. So the contractor doesn't need to price for compensation events. They will be added on to the prices. Okay. So effectively, there's two questions you ask. Is it a compensation event, yes or no? If no, stop. And if yes, how is it assessed? And assuming the contractor is entitled to the compensation event, you broadly speaking, you say, what's the change in methods compared with what you were planning to do as a result of the compensation event? Therefore, what's the change in resources that you're planning to use compared with what were in the accepted programme? You price those up and then you add on a fee percentage which the contractor tenders up front. And that's effectively his margin.
So the core risks and events are listed all in clause 60.1.
Yeah, they're all listed in one place. So rather than having to look throughout the contract and try and find them and everything, you just turn to 60.1 on page 15 of the contract and just look down until you come across one which, if you're a contractor, hopefully matches the situation which you've encountered. If you don't come across one, you don't get anything.
Does the programme go into the requisite level of detail? So when an event does occur, the contract goes into the requisite level of detail?
Well, really, I would say it's not. It's the programme. It states what the contract states what the programme's got to show, but it's only a contract. The project manager has to really understand what's in the programme, so that when a compensation event occurs, the base is there to say, right, this happened. This was the consequences. We agree that was the consequences because I understand your programme, and therefore it's easily agreeable. At this stage for level 3, you're effectively doing efficient and rapid administration of the contract. You're not actually managing the event. You're saying this has happened, this is how we dealt with it, but you might have let it run, but we're wrapping it up rapidly, so there's a rolling final account, and therefore at the end of the contract, the final account's agreed within a month or two of the end of the contract. And people can see the trend of where the project's going.
Now, as we know, on site, operations affect subsequent operations, so the linkages between phases of the project need to be absolutely clear.
Absolutely. Enough detail within each operation so that the disruption is as evident as it can be, given that disruption is what causes a lot of the argument. But having said that, bar has extended by 2 days or whatever, clearly evident that what the knock-on effects are.
Okay, let's consider the 4th level of use of the programme.
Use 4. Minimisation of consequences by the project manager.
So does the contract help site teams get decisions in a timely fashion?
Okay, well, this is where it starts getting proactive. Essentially, in my years of doing training, certainly initially, the number of times I spoke to a resident engineer and they said, if only I knew the consequences of my decision, I wouldn't have made it, or I'd have made it by then. So here it's the project manager being able to look at the programme and knowing what decision to make on behalf of the employer and when to make it so as not to cause the delay.
So the consequences are transparent from the programme?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, talk to us a little bit about the requirements of the project manager's role during the contract, because he's got a multiplicity of functions, hasn't he?
This is where there's the one bit of case law on the contract. Costain versus Bechtel. I won't go into the details, but broadly speaking, the project manager has 2 roles. He has the traditional administration role, and he has a management role under the contract. The administration role is that whenever something's submitted to him for acceptance, he has to evaluate it as an independent, neutral would. Knowledge of the technology, if you like, based on the information presented to him. The management role is to act in the best interests of the client, and he's given many more powers under the contract to influence the outcome or control the outcome. Is a bit extreme compared with traditional forms of contract. So to give an example, there might be a project which has a time deadline. A compensation event occurs. The project manager says, give me 3 quotations based on different ways of dealing with this. One might be time dominated, one least cost dominated, one least risk dominated. He has to evaluate those as an independent neutral would, rather than sort of pushing them down, etc. But having done that, he could then say, well, actually, this quote, it's a school, it's got a time deadline, it's got to open by the start of term. That's the one I'm going to go for. So, and in his management role, he picks the best option, given the client's objectives and the current project circumstances.
So the project manager is like a good football defender. His timely interceptions save the impact on time and cost.
Yeah, and a good defender sees where the game's developing and gets his positioning right in the first place.
Okay, let's move on to the 5th level of use of the programme.
Use 5. enable joint working to minimise the consequences of an early warning.
Tell us about the early warning process.
Well, the early warning process is a contractual mechanism which just represents good project management to identify problems early or issues which may affect, in non-contractual language, time, cost or quality. You tell the other party, and then you have in the third edition a risk reduction meeting. That could be a big formal affair where big important people come to site. It could be two engineers walk out on site, look down a hole and say, if we move the service a metre that way, problem solved. It's regardless of contractual ownership. So sometimes that can be the contractor's problem, sometimes it can be the employer's problem or owned risk, in which case it would become a compensation event. But it's a management procedure.
And this is entered into the risk register, which is a living document, updated all the time throughout the duration of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Early warnings are entered into it and actions which come out of the risk reduction meeting. And it's a contractual obligation when you hold a risk reduction meeting to come away with actions rather than just blame the other party or run around in panic. They're entered into the risk register, so the risk register in that sense expands as the project goes along, but equally it's the project manager's duty to take out risks, take out actions as the time has passed. So either the risk hasn't occurred or it has occurred but you've done actions to deal with it. So it's constantly pared down to be a workable size of document.
What would you do for, say, a medium-sized event? Presumably the first thing you do is identify whether it's on the critical path or not.
Well, first of all, you notify as an early warning. You then go have a risk reduction meeting. As I said, it could be big formal affair, could be the two project managers sit down in the office and discuss it. I would suggest that you look at the programme and you say, oh, what are the consequences? What's the do-nothing consequences? Is it on the critical path? Have we got some free float? So float off the critical path. In which case we can, even though our project is time dominated, the solution we need is not time dominated because say we've got 2 weeks to actually deal with it before it starts to delay the overall project. So understand the consequences, agree the consequences, then actually say, right, how are we going to manage the way out? And again, look at the programme to manage your way out. What are our options? And engineers, I have to say, because they're left brain thinkers, logical thinkers, they like to think of something and logic it to the nth degree, rather than the secret of having good ideas is have lots of ideas, yeah, and then evaluate them and merge them and so on. So that's what happens. You then decide, is it depending on, fairly early on, you probably say, is this a compensation event, yes or no? If it's not, the contractor leads with the employer's vice project manager's help. If it is a compensation event, the project manager would lead with the contractor's help.
Let's take a look at the sixth and final use of the programme.
Use 6. Central document around which the parties collaborate to reduce time and cost.
Right, this is really where you really are getting very proactive in that you're not waiting for a problem to occur before you collaborate. You're looking at the programme from day one of the contract and both parties are saying, having understand it, because you've got to have the understanding to contribute meaningfully, how do we take out time and or cost? And normally if you take out time, you take out cost as well.
I guess early warnings under use 5 help to demonstrate this point, but give us some other examples.
There's one project years ago which I looked at, and essentially you had a security fence around Heathrow and a service had to come through it and go out the other side. And the works information said, bring the fence up, the service up to there, construct a temporary fence around there, dismantle this fence, put the service through, reassemble it, take down the temporary fence. Project manager, who was very involved in the project, exemplar project, said, well actually summer's approaching, if I put 2 security guards on there on a decent day, can you do it in one day? And the contractor said, yeah, I think we can. So it was originally programmed for 4+ days, they did it in a day. Client got time, which was important to them. Contractor obviously saved some money.
So how much do all parties rely on the project manager's understanding of both technical issues and his understanding also of the programme as well?
Well, I think that at this level, there are some people who say a good project manager can project manage anything, and there is some truth in them that if they're surrounded by good people. On a smallish project where there is the project manager, you've got to have the technical appreciation and awareness and the experience of durations, etc., and how things are done. And you've got to be involved in the project. You can't be a sort of high-level project manager who flutters around from 3 to 4 projects and then shakes the hand of the client before fluttering back in and out. They've got to be involved. They've got to also have the authority within the client organisation to make decisions and relax constraints. If they're constantly having to refer upwards to get decisions, then they don't have the power under the contract which is needed to operate at this level.
Now, in your experience, what level of use do project teams generally aspire to of the programme?
Well, one of the reasons for coming up with these 6 levels was to actually give people a sort of stepped ladder approach to aspire to the term best practice. You can always do better practice. Next year there might be 7 levels. Is to actually say, well, what level are we aiming for, given the resources we have on the project? In terms of so it's hard so people haven't consciously done it. In terms of what I've seen in practice, at times they're barely at 1 when I'm asked to go in and try and sort out the mess. Yeah, and you've got lots of minor compensation events which cause lots of disruption, and they're just chasing their tails, trying to manage the consequences on site and the contractual consequences. On other sites, they're at level 6.
So if you go to a calm site, possibly they're demonstrating higher levels of usage.
Yeah, I mean, there's one project where I have to say the regional contractor often got me in at the tail end. I consistently said, for God's sake, get me in early. And we did a start-up workshop, talked about objectives, got people talking to each other, identified risks, talked about them. About a third was on the NEC, and one of these things which I sort of pointed out was something like this. They also had subsequent training on it, and they spent a lot of effort setting up the protocols, the processes on site to work efficiently, and that joint understanding. And the net result was, as a target cost contract, they brought the contract in ahead of time, below target, etc. Client was delighted. During it, I remember the regional project manager, director phoning me up, and perhaps he had a heritage of traditional contracting, but almost complaining that when he turned up on site, there was an aura of calm around site. Everybody seemed to be doing things in a measured way, and things were just happening, and almost complaining that there was nothing for him to get his teeth into. That's an example of a good project, in my view. There are other ones. There's one project I was involved in where it was a bypass around a city centre, and effectively for every week of the contract it was going back a week because the client hadn't got access to properties for the contractor to work. And the contractor could have sat back and said, these are compensation events, I get the time, I get the money. Yeah. Instead what they did was they organised a workshop where they got employers' people involved, their people involved, at site level rather than just the programme, and subcontractors. And we, it wasn't on the day, but through 12 weeks on the day, 20 weeks in total, completely looked at the programme and took out 20 weeks from a 2-year programme when the contractor had been involved early on. Just so that was a sort of a headline event to be proactive rather than a face-to-face. But that's an example of how you can do it.
Now, John, earlier on you were telling us how the NEC had developed over the last 17 years. How do you see things developing going forward?
Well, I think that now that you've got the supply contract out and you've got the term services contract out with a little bit of modification which can be used for outsourcing, and that's the classic outsourcing is IT stuff. I think you're going to see it expand not just into heavy engineering, also outside of civil engineering, but also into heavy engineering, which it's doing at the moment, more into building, which it's doing at the moment, but also into IT and outsourcing and so on. And I also think it's going to be expanded around the world. So I regularly go to New Zealand. I've got a colleague in Mumbai at the moment. I'm increasingly be asked to travel around the world. to propagate the message and train people up.
I'm afraid we're right out of time, John. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us. Fantastic stuff.
Pleasure.
Don't forget there's more in the study notes, but until the next time, goodbye.